Welcome. We are so thrilled to have you join us today for our December Lunch and Learn webinar. I'm Tammy Thompson, Deep Roots Outreach and Conference Manager, and I am delighted to spend this last month of 2022 with you all. Thanks for joining us. We returned this month with our third of our 5-part beginner and refresher series. In coordination with Mid-America Regional Council and the Health Forward Foundation, Deep Roots developed a series of foundational webinars for beginning native gardeners and folks looking to brush up in certain areas and fill in some knowledge gaps. So I'm delighted to roll out the third in that series today. We will continue the series for 2 more months. So we've got two more webinars in the series before we finish up. And it will culminate in a roundtable with experts to kind of fill in the gaps and answer any questions that we have. Before I talk about today's topic, I would like to acknowledge a few people and do a few announcements. First of all, we are incredibly grateful to the Alvin L. Gottlieb Foundation, Mid-America Regional Council, and the Missouri Department of Conservation for their partnership on this series and their generous sponsorship of this series and all that we do here at Deep Roots. We are also grateful to you for your support of our programs, our webinars, and many of you are donate as well, and we are so grateful. So this last month of December, we just want to tell you how much we appreciate you as well. As always, this webinar will be recorded and up on the Deep Roots website by Monday. So you'll also receive an email from me with the link to the recording and any resources that we talk about during this broadcast. So watch your email and our website. If you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you'll also be notified each time we upload a video. So last month, we covered digging up the dirt on healthy soils. And that recording and its content or its resources are up on our website right now. So you can view any of the recordings from our first of the 3-part series, as well as the resources. And there are a ton of resources for those. So please check those out. Today, we are honored to have Deep Roots alum Sarah Beyer lead us through planning your native garden project. That's planning instead of before planting. So we plan before we plant. This session will focus on site assessment and the steps and the questions we need to ask to begin a successful native garden project. Sarah is an excellent instructor. She's a master naturalist and a consultant. And today she's going to help us learn about the basics of assessing a space, the equipment that we might need, and what to look for before putting plants in the ground. So because this series will build upon each other, builds on each one, we will not have a Q&A portion of the webinar today. But hang on to those questions, because at the end of this 5-part series, we will bring together subject matter experts to help us navigate those questions and kind of put it all together. We also have an exhaustive resource list for you to that accompanies this particular program. We believe these resources will serve both the beginner and the veteran gardener, so we encourage you to refer to those resources as you go through the series with us. So let's get this party started. During the program, feel free to share your experiences with each other in the chat feature. Stop sharing that. My apologies. Sorry, that kind of threw me off a little bit. We won't have a Q&A feature this time. So hold on to those questions until we get to our last episode where we will cover that. So with that, I am honored to introduce our speaker today. Sarah Beyer is a Deep Roots alum and owner of Oak and IO. Most of you know Sarah for her years behind this series and knows she is certainly a credible authority in this space. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen again, this time successfully, and we will introduce Sarah and let Sarah take it away. Thanks.
Hello and welcome back. My name is Sarah Beyer. I am a Kansas City-based native landscaping consultant with Oak and IO. I'd like to welcome you to the third in our webinar series. Today's webinar is called Planning Your Native Garden Project, and we're going to do just that. We're so happy that you're here. This series is a project between Mid-America Regional Council and Deep Roots. It is generously funded by the Health Forward Foundation, and we're so thankful for their support. We're so glad that you're here today. Can't wait to get started. Okay, so first, just a quick overview of the topics we'll discuss today. We're going to talk first about site selection and site assessment. Both of those will just give you some tools to help you decide where to place your new native garden and how to make sure it fits into your overall goals for the property itself. And then we'll talk about site preparation and how you're going to remove the existing vegetation and some options for how to do that to prepare your new garden for planting. So the first thing with site selection to consider is the level of urgency. Do you have a particular need to work on a particular part of your property or yard right now? Maybe you have an aging tree that needs to come down, and so you have a need to replace that. Do you have an unsightly view that you need to screen as quickly as possible? Are you removing some invasive plants and need to have something to go into their place? Those sorts of things may help you decide what part of the property you want to work on first. Secondly, consider how much time and energy you have. Consider what size garden you can keep up with. They will require more care in the beginning and somewhat less as they become established. So that may also help you to decide which part of the property you're going to work on first. And finally, consider your overall goals for your yard and how the garden you're considering fits into those goals. So even if you only intend to do a small wildflower garden, a pollinator planting, and you know where you want to put it, I highly recommend digging into the site assessment for the entire property before you actually break any ground. So the tools that we're going to need in order to assess our site, you'll need graph paper and a pencil with an eraser. Graph paper comes in both smaller and larger squares. I like a 1/4 inch, but whatever you can find will most likely work for your project, and I'll explain how to kind of scale up or down if you need to. You might want a straight edge, like a ruler or a T-square to help you draw straight lines. A household tape measure of 25 to 35 feet should work just fine. You may need to stretch it out multiple times and add it up for some of those longer measurements. So if this is something that you plan on doing a lot, or if you're looking into starting landscaping as a business, you may want to invest in a measuring wheel or a 100-foot tape measure. That'll save you a lot of time and headache on those longer measurements. Laser tape measures are unfortunately not all that handy outdoors. Inside they work great because you nearly always have a wall or something solid to point the laser at to kind of bounce the measurement back. Outdoors you can't always count on having a tree or the side of a building available. And then finally, this orange assessment sheet. This was put together by the University of Missouri Extension Service, and I will link to it in the supplemental materials that accompany this webinar. I'll cover the most important points in the next section, but I do encourage you to download that and go through it in its entirety for the entire space. So first, when we draw the site, we're going to go outside. We're going to measure everything we can think of to measure. I'm going to measure the house, the sidewalks, the property itself, the location away from the house or away from the sidewalk of any trees, shrubs, any existing gardens. The easiest way to do that is to create a scale drawing. And the easiest way to think of the scale drawing is that each line on the paper represents a 1-foot distance from the previous line. So from one line to the next is 1 foot, and then each square is 1 square foot. So you want to start with the biggest outlines of the property first. So the property lines, the outline of the house. And if this is all too big for your paper at 1 foot per square, then make each square 2 feet long or 5 feet long or whatever you need to do in order to make it fit. You just want to make sure that you make note of the scale that you're using and that you're consistent with it so that you have the same scale throughout the entire process. So our straight lines, our house outlines, our property edges are probably fairly easy to plot on the paper, but how do we recreate a curve on our scale drawing? So this can get a little bit tricky, but hopefully my simple line drawings here can make it a little bit easier for you. Basically, to measure and recreate a curved edge, we need to know its position relative to a straight edge. So in this example, we're going to use this imaginary flower bed and pretend that it runs alongside the house and let the house be our straight edge. Depending on the situation, your straight edge might be a curb at the street, it might be a sidewalk, it might be just a long measuring tape, one of those 100-foot measuring tapes placed alongside the curve. That gives you a straight edge to measure off of, and then that will help you to translate this curved edge to your graph paper. So the first thing we're going to do is measure along the straight edge in intervals of 3 to 5 feet. My curve is pretty gentle here, so I'm using 5 feet, but if your curve turns more sharply, then you may want to use 3 feet and just kind of take a few measurements and see how it's working out for you and then adjust if you need to. So I've marked my 5-foot sections in orange at the bottom here as we go along the front of the house for the first 25 feet. Once you have your increments written down along that or measured out along that straight edge, then you'll need to take a measurement of how far the curve is from the straight edge at each of those points. So imagine these orange lines as my measuring tape, measuring from the front of the house to the edge of the flower bed. So we're going to write down the distance from the straight edge at each point. And that gives us our measurements. In this case, we have 6 points of measurements, these 6 red dots. So for each one, I'll have written, starting from the left, corner of the house or 0 feet. And then the measurement out is, let's say, 5 feet in this example. And then at 5 feet, the measurement out is 6 feet. At 10 feet, the measurement out, and so on and so forth as you go down. So once you have those, then you can take those 6 red dots and plot them on your paper. So you can see here, I've gone over 5 squares and then out the appropriate distance for each one. Once my points are plotted, I can draw in my line. So this takes a little bit of practice to get, but just remember, it doesn't have to be perfect. We're really just trying to get the rough layout down so that we can have a picture of the space in its entirety and so that we can work on design in our next section. We'll focus on that in the next webinar. So next, let's take a look and walk through this MU extension assessment tool. Again, check the supplemental materials for the link. So first thing, for safety, we're going to locate our utilities and we're going to add those to the diagram along with our major outlines. We're going to make sure to note both overhead power lines so we don't plant a tree that will get large underneath them. We're also going to note underground utilities. So you will need to call whatever the appropriate marking or one call center is for your location. If you're in Missouri or Kansas, the numbers are on the screen there. And once the property has been marked, you'll want to plot those lines on your graph paper. And you want to make sure that you avoid accidentally breaking anything. It can be extremely dangerous in the case of underground gas or electrical lines, but it can also just be costly. If you cut your Google Fiber line, you may be responsible for the cost of replacing it. So you want to dig in the immediate area of those marked services and underground utilities. You want to dig extremely carefully if you have to, and only with hand tools. Also, consider that anything planted over those easement areas might be lost if the utility company needs to upgrade their system in the future. They may need to dig right through your garden in order to do so. So consider that in your overall placement and potentially just avoid those areas altogether if you can. Next, we're going to look at light and shadow. It's important to take a few days or even a full growing season if you can to observe the patterns of sunlight in your space. So if we look at this picture here, you might assume that the area along the left side of the fence there is a great place for a plant that likes a lot of sun. But if you look at the context around that spot and look at all of these trees and think through what happens as the day progresses, you can easily imagine that this space might end up being a shady location most of the day and not at all appropriate for a full sun plant. So you want to spend a day or two documenting patterns of light and shadow in the areas that you want to plant. Go out at least 3 times. You want to go out morning, noon, and afternoon. More is better if you can, just to really give yourself an idea of how the shadows progress through the space. If you don't have the luxury of spending a full day at the site, it's important that you understand how the angle of the sun affects the shadows that are cast by buildings and larger plants. So the north sides of the house or the north side of the tree is going to receive the most shade, followed by the east, then the west, and the southern exposures get the most sun. So you want to look at the trees, the structures, the shrubs, and the neighboring buildings to estimate the areas of shade and sun. Finally, you want to understand that these areas will change with the season. So the summer sun is going to be a lot more direct, and shadows on the north and east side shrink up closer to the building during that time of more direct sun. So in the image here, you can imagine that the shadow cast by the house during the winter is going to be stretching farther to the north than it will when the sun's angle is more directly overhead. So there's still going to be shade on the north side during the summer, but it just isn't going to stretch as far. And so you want to understand that as you're choosing your plants as well, especially if you're doing your measurements and your observations in the early spring in February or in March, which is a fine time to do it. You just want to understand that those shadows are going to change a bit during the hot, direct sun in the middle of the summer. So once you understand the light and shadow patterns, you can start to figure out what plants will be happy in the space. And we'll talk more about this in our next webinar. But for now, I want to address the difference between some of these designations, particularly part shade and part sun, which sound like they could easily mean the same thing. So, how much part? What is part shade? What is part sun? So both terms mean that the plant needs 3 to 6 hours of direct sun per day. However, if you can imagine being shaded in the morning and in the sun in the afternoon is a lot different from the opposite, being in the sun in the morning and the shade in the afternoon, that hot, scorching afternoon sun. So I like to remember these, that they're named by what they need in the afternoon. So therefore, part shade plants need morning sun, afternoon shade, and part sun plants are happiest with that hot, direct afternoon sun. Plants that are marked as full sun will need at least 6 hours of sunlight. Some will need more, and shade plants need to be protected from that midday and afternoon sun particularly. And of course, with all of these designations, there's lots of differences, lots of little niches that plants occupy within those kind of relatively big buckets of light needs. A lot more plants, for example, can take dappled shade than will be happy in all day deep shade. So it's important to do a little reading on the plants that you select and consider where they're found in nature. A full sun prairie plant is probably going to need more hours of full sun than a full sun glade plant, or one that might grow on a woodland edge but prefer a lot of sun, just because those areas are naturally going to have some tree shadows and other things that those plants are well adapted to versus a plant that's naturally found in the middle of the prairie with no tree in sight. So another reason to do a little research on where the native plants you are selecting actually live in nature. Next, looking at moisture and drainage, there are several ways to get to know what the water patterns, what the moisture is like on your site. So first, just visually, we're going to observe the space during a rain or during watering. Where does the land slope? Where does water pool? Steep slopes will tend to be dry, especially if they get that afternoon sun. Low-lying areas tend to stay more moist, especially if they don't get much sun. So take all of those things into consideration and do some visual observations, make some notes. Next, in the areas that you plan to plant, take some time to dig around and see what the soil is like. Squeeze a handful and then let it go. If it stays clumped together or it's moist, if it falls back apart, then it's dry. Then set the soil down, brush your palms together, and if afterwards your hands appear clean, then you know your soil is very dry in that area. If they look more like this picture, then your soil is very moist in that area. Consider how long it's been since the last rain to put your observations in context. And then repeat this exercise a few days later and see how things have changed. You can also take a shovel slice of soil and take a look at it for moisture as well. So you're going to stick the blade of the shovel in as far as it will go, and then carefully lift it out, move about 1 inch to 1.5 inches over, and do it again so that you have this little slice in between those two holes. Then carefully reach in and pull out that slice, and you can lay it down and look at the layers to view the drier and more moist layers of soil. You can make a note of how deep the moisture lies, really get to know in depth what the soil and the moisture in the soil is like in the location where you're going to plant. And finally, consider the drainage. Do you have areas that never fully dry? Make note of those so that you can select appropriate plants when we get to the design phase. You can also do a drainage test if you're not sure about how quickly or slowly a particular area drains. So you dig a hole, kind of fill it with water, and then observe the water levels until it has completely drained out. And I'll put some more detailed instructions on how to go about that test and what you're looking for in our supplemental materials as well. Next, we're going to consider the views. So consider what you want to see as you look out the window from inside the home. What do you want to see out your bedroom window? What would you like to look at while you're doing dishes at the kitchen sink? So think about those things, and then go outside and look in all directions for multiple spots in the yard. Think about what you want to highlight. Maybe there's a nice view from your patio that you want to make sure that you don't block. Maybe you like to watch the sunset from the front porch. What do you want to obscure? Are there views you'd rather not look at? Are there utility boxes or poles that you'd prefer to screen? Are there areas where you need privacy from the neighbors, privacy from the street? Consider these once you start choosing your plants. And you can make note of these. You can write them down alongside your space outline. You can add a piece of tracing paper over the top and kind of write them in the spaces where you make the observations, or they can be a separate document, however it works for you. And then finally, go out and walk around the neighborhood and view your house from multiple places in the on the street, across the street. What do you want people to see when they are approaching your home? What things would you like to de-emphasize as people are approaching your homes? Things you might like to screen or otherwise hide. Next, consider your use of space. What functions does the yard currently serve? What functions would you like to see in the future? Consider things like places for kids and pets to play. Consider outdoor entertaining or retreat spaces, things like vegetable gardens. Consider your needs both now and for as long as you plan to stay in the home and how they may change. Also, don't forget, we need to provide for our birds and our butterflies as well. So make sure when you get to the design phase that you're considering the need for lots of native plants, lots of flowering plants to help attract and provide for those important wildlife as well. Next, we're going to take a look at our existing plants and identify them. So there's several apps that can help you identify plants. For trees, consider using an identification tool called a dichotomous key, or if you type in your state and tree ID, it's likely you'll be able to find some resources in the form of books or websites that can help you figure out what the trees and shrubs that you have in your yard are. Particularly for those trees and shrubs, we want to consider what their current size is. In the example here, we've got a very small bur oak on the left that can reach 70 to 80 feet tall and wide. So we need to know the mature size of that tree when we're planning the rest of that space. And we also need to know how fast it will get to that mature size. And then on the right, we have a more mature sized tree that we already know how big it's going to get and can more easily plan around that as is. We also want to take a look during this phase to remove invasive species, to identify whether we have any and to remove them. So the species highlighted on this slide are shrub honeysuckle, burning bush, Japanese honeysuckle, English ivy, and the top right there is our Bradford or Callery pear. All of these are invasive. They cause both economic and ecological harm. And if you have them on your property, then this would be the time to look into removing them and replacing them in the next phase. If you need help finding out what is invasive in your area or how to identify it, contact your local conservation department. For folks in Missouri and Kansas, I will have resources in our materials as well to help you find lists of those and information sheets on how to identify and how to remove. Next, we'll look at our site preparation. So the first thing that we want to do is to outline or mark the area, and then we can proceed with our next steps after that. My favorite way to do this is just with your garden hose or a coil of rope, and you just lay it out where you want the edges of the bed to be, and then you can easily kind of pull and tug it and adjust to get everything how you want it before you begin. You can also use a little sprinkle of like flour or play sand or something light colored and non-toxic to mark the lines around where you want the edges to be. If you need the outlines to stay for multiple days, you can use yard flags or look into like athletic field marking paint for something that needs to be a little bit more permanent if it's going to say rain or be several days before you'll actually get around to removing the vegetation, which is our next step. So we're going to remove the existing vegetation. There are several methods of doing this. All of them have pros and cons. Evaluate your options. Consider your physical ability, your time constraints, and what you're ethically comfortable with. And then make a choice and go with it. Like I said, all of these have downsides. Some of them are controversial, but all of them cause some disturbance. In my opinion, the benefit of establishing a beneficial garden of native plants is worth that one-time disturbance, no matter which option you choose. So first thing, we're looking at physical removal. So this is just what it sounds like, digging out the top of the sod to replace, remove and replace the existing vegetation. So on the positive side, you don't need any herbicide here. On the negative side, it can be time and labor intensive. If you rent or purchase a sod cutter, then you have the expense of running that machine as well. And it does damage the soil structure by removing that top layer, which allows erosion to occur more easily. Next option is chemical removal, talking about using an herbicide to kill off the existing grass or whatever vegetation may be there. On the positive side is sometimes this is your only feasible option. If you have a very large area, not like what's pictured here, but say you have 100 acres of invasive Johnson grass and you want to make it into a prairie. That prairie simply is not going to happen without herbicide. On the residential garden scale, this approach doesn't require intense manual labor, so it might be ideal for someone with physical limitations that would prevent them from choosing one of our other options. On the negative side, of course, we have exposure hazards to humans, to wildlife. The soil biology may be negatively affected by the chemical application, and we all live upstream and downstream, so looking out for things getting into our water supplies. Obviously, this is not a solution to pursue without some thought and some precautions. Next, looking at solarization. So this is where you take a large clear plastic sheet place it down over the area that you want to kill the vegetation, weight it down with rocks to keep it down close to the vegetation, and then leave it through some hot sunny days. So the pros, you again don't need herbicide. You can kind of set it and forget it for several days. You don't have to, take a lot of care with this. There's not a lot of intense manual labor. On the negative side, you have to either store or dispose of this plastic after you're done with it. A lot of times they are not able to be used again. It depends on the thickness that you get and what happens over the course of the time that it's on the land. It does take some time. The heat may damage the soil biology, and you're limited the size of your project by the size of sheeting that you can obtain or afford. And also it's only seasonally effective. So you cannot do this when the temperatures are cool. So this was a project that I worked on this right side here. This space is actually full sun most of the day. This is an evening photo after the sheeting had been put down. We did add additional rocks after this to help hold it a little tighter, especially on that downslope. And then after about a week of really sunny, hot days, this is what we were able to see through the sheeting, a lot of dead grass. So it really is effective as long as the conditions are right for it. Next, looking at the cardboard and compost method, this is probably my favorite method for most situations. On the positive side, again, no herbicides are needed here. It is relatively inexpensive and it's safer for the soil biology. On the negative side, you can be limited by your access to materials. If you have a very large site like this one here, this took several loads of cardboard, so sourcing all of that can be a little bit time intensive, and it can be labor intensive to lay it all out. So the first thing we did was to lay cardboard down over all of the existing plants, making sure to overlap the edges by 6 inches or so. In the photo here, we've laid logs down, but that's not necessarily something you'll have to do. This site was large enough that the cardboard application took place over several days, during which we also had storms coming through the area. So in order to keep our cardboard where it belonged, we weighted it down. You may not need to weight your cardboard down with anything besides the compost. So you want to spread a layer of compost about 2 to 3 inches deep over the entire area. Ideally, you're going to then let this get rained on a few times or watered deeply a few times before you plant. So now you're ready to plant, and you can just punch through the cardboard with a hand trowel to put in your plants. As the plants mature and fill in, the cardboard's going to degrade and allow them to spread out. But for the first couple of years, it's going to prevent the previous plants from being able to emerge up through that cardboard. So it works pretty effectively there. This is also the point where you'll want to consider and potentially install edging or little picket fencing, whatever you're going to add around the edges of your planting. So you can get creative here. You might have a nice walkway already existing, like in that photo on the left. You can use bricks or stone or logs. Here's an example with some willow branches bent to create a fence. You can also weave small branches to create what's called a wattle fence. And so those may be branches that are, if you have silver maples like I do, they're constantly dropping branches for you to use for a wattle fence. Or if you have some invasive shrub honeysuckle that you've removed, those make an excellent product to weave through to make a fence. And this can be made as tall or short as you'd like. Even just logs laid on the ground create a visually clean edge. And having these clean edges just goes a long way toward making your planting look neat and intentional. Even if things behind the edge get a little bit wild and woolly, to the untrained eye, that nice clean edge really helps to say, this is intentional, this is a garden, this has value, this is being taken care of. Also, don't forget about signage. Check out garden signs available from Deep Roots that will help you communicate the benefits of your native planting to your neighbors. There's a link to those in the supplemental resources for you to check out. Next up, we'll apply mulch or compost. I like to do this before planting and then just plant through it. You can also plant first and then mulch around it. Some of that may depend on the type of mulch that you choose or just your personal preference. So as we discussed earlier, you can use compost as a mulch to protect the soil around your new plants. Other options include just a wood mulch, pine straw, raked or shredded leaves. Consider again where your plant grows in nature and try to match the mulch to something that that plant might experience in nature. So especially for our full sun prairie plants, they're not used to a heavy coating of leaves every fall. So keeping that mulch more light and airy will help to save you on weeding, but also be a little bit more, feel a little more like home to those plants. So use the decorative stone little pea gravels with caution and only in well-shaded areas. The heat that stone holds when the sun shines right on it can scorch both your plants and the beneficial soil microorganisms underneath. So unless you're aiming for something that is very well adapted to that sort of thing, probably best to use a different type of ground cover. We also want to make sure we never use rubber mulch or shredded tires. It's just not a healthy material to have on the soil and around your plants. Most gardens will benefit from the use of mulch in the first 1 to 2 years to cut down on your weeding needs, help retain water. In our next webinar, we'll also discuss how to design your garden using more plants closer together and what we call green mulch, which will help eliminate the need for mulch beyond that initial establishment period. But even if you're doing that, you may still wish to mulch for the first year, maybe 2. So now that you have your basics and you've considered your site preparation, let's take a look at our new garden checklist. First thing you want to do is spend some time getting to know your space, whether that's setting aside a day or 2 to work through the assessment, draw your sketches, or maybe you're going to wait the first full growing season after you move into a new home to really think about what you want to put where and what your goals are. You want to draw everything that you can to scale to really help you plan in detail and make sure that the project you're working on today or this week doesn't conflict down the line with something you may decide that you want to do next year. You want to consider your desired functions, the views, how all of your needs might change in the future. Next, you want to prepare the site, consider your edging, consider signage. And finally, you'll be ready to design your space. So come back next time. We'll look at some design tips, some planting tips, and we'll dig into all of the details there. If you would like to learn more, I recommend checking out the supplemental resources that accompany this webinar. You can find those on both Mid-America Regional Council and Deep Roots websites at mark.org and deeproots.org. The Planet Native Conference is always a fabulous resource for native plant education, inspiration, and connections. You can learn more at planetnative.org. And if you have questions, you can contact either Mid-America Regional Council or Deep Roots with the information on your screen. Thank you for joining us. We hope you come back next time for native plant design.
Well, that was absolutely excellent. It doesn't matter how many times I'm in my garden. Each time I have a video like this, there's always something that I'm either reminded of or a new thing that I've learned. So I hope for you that was the case as well. So thank you, Sarah, for just being a great resource for us and always being willing to share what you know. I'm going to go ahead and start our closeout here. All right, and share my screen. Always so much to do. All right, so So, as I mentioned, we will continue this series for the next couple of months. We have 2 more sessions to go. We will build on what we learn each session and bring it all together at the end. If you know someone interested in native plants, please invite them to join us next time. And please invite them to join or to view the webinars that we've already done. So now I want to let you know about a few other things going on. Native Plants at Noon, I think many of you are already viewers of that, occurs every third Thursday of the month. And this month, we will go back on the road to the Bob Brown conservation area in Northwest Missouri. This area is teeming with migratory birds, and we will share how the Missouri Department of Conservation works to ensure that the habitat for these waterfowl meets their needs for a successful journey, migratory journey. I am so excited to share this site with you all. I got a chance to go up there last week, and it's phenomenal. It's a different kind of Native Plants at Noon, where we'll focus a little bit more on wildlife, but I think you're just absolutely going to love it. It's just a little bit north of St. Joseph, Missouri. So I'm really excited to share that with you. And next month, we will build on our series with our new segment in the foundational series, the DIY native garden design. And Sarah will bring us back together to talk about garden design and garden design elements. I think many of us are a little intimidated by garden design. So I'm really excited about this particular session as well for everyone. And next, starting in 2023, which is just a month away, we are going to start announcing some really exciting programs, new to Deep Roots, new to our community too. So we're really excited to announce some things that we have cooking, and we'd love for you to join us. We will do some announcements of those during our webinars next month. So tune in. And all of our events and webinars are on our website at www.deeproots.org/events. So please hop on over there to see what's coming up. And while you're there, if you would consider making a donation, especially here at the end of the year, we would be so grateful. So thank you for joining us. We will see you in a few weeks for Native Plants at Noon. And always remember, what you plant matters. Thanks.